Any attempt to ground morality in subjective preference or cultural endorsement faces an immediate and unsettling challenge. If moral truth depends only on what individuals or groups happen to value, then even the most abhorrent acts become modally permissible. The worry is not that people currently endorse atrocities, but that the structure of the theory leaves open too many nearby possible worlds in which such endorsements count as moral. This openness feels normatively dangerous. To make subjective morality livable, something must anchor it, some baseline condition that distinguishes legitimate moral preferences from pathological ones. Without such grounding, subjectivism risks collapsing into a framework where any preference, no matter how deranged, could be elevated to moral truth. The task, then, is to articulate a form of subjectivity that can still impose principled constraints on what counts as a morally admissible preference, preserving flexibility while blocking catastrophic moral drift. The central worry is that if morality is treated as subjective preference or cultural relativity, then nothing prevents moral norms from drifting into horrifying territory, including the possibility that a society or individual could come to regard something like torturing babies for fun as good. This modal openness feels normatively dangerous. If moral truth depends only on what people happen to prefer or what a culture endorses, then moral prohibitions become fragile, contingent, and vulnerable to catastrophic shifts. People who hold objective morality see this as an unacceptable risk, because the theory allows too many nearby possible worlds in which atrocities become morally correct. This is why they demand guardrails, constraints strong enough to block such slippage, not just in practice but in principle. Without those constraints, the worldview seems unsafe to adopt, because history already shows that cultures can drift toward atrocity, and a purely preference-based theory seems to license that drift rather than resist it. The result is a deep modal objection. A moral framework that permits horrific norms in possible worlds is, for many, too risky to accept in the actual world. A preference-based or culturally relative morality permits atrocity not because anyone wants that outcome, but because the structure of the theory lacks a non-arbitrary grounding that can constrain what counts as a moral preference. If moral truth is nothing more than what individuals or groups endorse, then the permissibility of even the most abhorrent acts becomes modally open. A shift in preference, psychology, or cultural norms could make them moral within that framework. This is the slippage problem. To avoid it, some theorists argue that subjectivity itself must be anchored in something deeper, some normative baseline that functions like an insanity plea for moral reasoning. The idea is that not all preferences are morally admissible, even on a subjective theory, because some preferences fail to meet minimal standards of rationality, coherence, empathy, or psychological normalcy. These standards don't make morality objective in the realist sense, but they do impose constraints strong enough to rule out pathological or deranged moral endorsements. In this view, a person who sincerely prefers torturing babies for fun is not expressing a legitimate moral stance, but exhibiting a breakdown of the very capacities that make moral subjectivity possible. Their preference is disqualified not because it violates objective moral facts, but because it violates the constitutive conditions for being a moral agent at all. This approach tries to preserve the flexibility and human-centeredness of subjective morality, while still blocking catastrophic moral drift by treating certain extreme preferences as normatively invalid. Akin to how legal systems treat actions arising from insanity as outside the domain of responsible agency, the hope is that this grounding can provide enough structure to make subjective morality stable and trustworthy without collapsing into full-blown moral realism. A stable subjective morality requires more than simply reporting what people prefer. It requires a deeper account of which preferences qualify as moral in the first place. By treating certain extreme or destructive preferences as failures of the very capacities that make moral agency possible, akin to an insanity plea in legal contexts, we can preserve the human-centered nature of subjective ethics, while still ruling out the modal possibility of moral horror. This approach does not smuggle in objective moral facts, but it does insist that moral subjectivity must be grounded in minimal standards of rationality, empathy, and psychological integrity. With these constraints in place, subjective morality becomes not a free-for-all of arbitrary preferences, but a structured space of humanly intelligible values, one that resists the slide into atrocity while remaining faithful to the lived texture of moral experience. A subjective moral framework can reject pathological preferences not by appealing to objective moral facts, but by appealing to the conditions that make a moral perspective intelligible, shareable, and epistemically defensible. The key idea is that even if morality is grounded in the subject, not all subjective states qualify as moral states. Some preferences fail to meet the minimal standards required for a worldview to function as a moral worldview at all. This is where grounding enters. A subjective theory must still explain what it means to count as a moral subject, and that explanation can impose constraints without abandoning subjectivity. Why subjective morality needs a grounding layer. A purely preference-based view treats every preference as morally valid for the agent, but this collapses into the slippage problem. If any preference counts, then even deranged or destructive preferences become moral whenever someone endorses them. To avoid this, subjectivists introduce a grounding layer that is epistemic, psychological, or agency-based, not moral. This layer says that only preferences formed under certain conditions, coherence, rationality, empathy, psychological integrity, count as moral preferences. The grounding is not a moral rule. It is a claim about what it takes to be a moral agent whose judgments have meaning. How this grounding blocks pathological preferences. Several kinds of grounding can serve this role. Epistemic grounding treats moral judgments as a kind of knowledge claim. A preference formed under delusion, incoherence, or radical irrationality fails to meet the conditions for knowledge. It is not a moral truth for the agent, because it is not a truth the agent can know. Psychological grounding treats morality as requiring certain capacities, empathy, perspective-taking, emotional regulation. A preference that arises from the breakdown of these capacities is not a moral preference, but a symptom of impaired agency. Agency grounding treats morality as a practice of giving and asking for reasons. A preference that cannot be justified to others, or even to oneself under reflection, fails to count as a moral stance, because it cannot participate in the practice of moral reasoning. These constraints do not appeal to objective moral facts. They appeal to the conditions of intelligibility for moral discourse itself. Why we reject preferences that others cannot comprehend. Even within a subjective framework, morality is not a private monologue. It is a collaborative enterprise. Humans are social, interdependent beings who seek worldviews that others can understand, evaluate, and potentially adopt. A moral perspective that is unintelligible to others fails a basic epistemic test. It cannot be explained, justified, or integrated into shared reasoning. This makes it unstable as a worldview. A preference like torturing babies for fun is good is not merely abhorrent. It is incomprehensible within the shared human framework of empathy, cooperation, and mutual recognition. Its unintelligibility signals that it does not rise from the capacities that make moral subjectivity possible. It is not rejected because it violates objective morality, but because it violates the conditions of shared rational agency. This is similar to how we treat delusional beliefs. They are not false opinions, but failures of the epistemic machinery that makes belief possible. Why incomprehensibility is a defeater for subjective moral commitment. A subjective moral worldview must still be explainable to oneself, communicable to others, coherent within a shared human cognitive framework, adoptable by other agents who share our basic capacities. If a preference cannot meet these conditions, then it cannot serve as a moral commitment. It becomes a breakdown of the very practice of moral reasoning. This is why subjectivists can reject pathological preferences without appealing to objective moral facts. The rejection is based on epistemic failure, not moral disagreement. A worldview that others cannot even understand is not merely unpopular, it is epistemically defective. It cannot guide action, cannot be justified, and cannot be part of a shared moral landscape. This gives us principled grounds, within subjectivism, to treat certain preferences as inadmissible. The deeper payoff. This approach preserves the core of subjectivism. Moral truth depends on the subject, while adding the structure needed to avoid catastrophic moral drift. It grounds morality not in external facts, but in the conditions of human agency, ensuring that subjective morality remains both flexible and stable, both personal and shareable. How the standard distinguishes harmless preferences from moral ones. A liking for chocolate cake is intelligible because it is coherent with ordinary human psychology. It can be explained. I like the taste. It is shareable. Others can understand why someone might like it. It does not violate the capacities that constitute agency. It is not a moral preference, but it is a rationally intelligible one. A moral judgment like abortion is permissible is intelligible because it can be grounded in reasons, autonomy, bodily integrity, risk, personhood. It can be articulated and defended. It is comprehensible to others, even those who disagree. It arises from the same capacities that structure moral reasoning. This makes it a candidate for moral discourse. The emerging picture. A subjective moral theory can remain subjective while still imposing principled constraints by grounding moral judgments in the factive conditions of human agency. These conditions determine when a preference is the kind of thing that can count as a moral judgment at all. This allows the theory to preserve subjectivity, block pathological preferences, maintain coherence and communicability, support complex moral reasoning, e.g., about abortion, avoid collapsing into moral relativism without standards. It is a way of saying, morality is subjective, but not every subjective state is moral. Why some attitudes feel like things we ought not have. Even in subjectivism. Subjectivism doesn't mean all attitudes are equally valid. It means moral truth depends on the subject. But the subject is not a blank slate. The subject is a reason-giving, socially embedded, psychologically structured agent. Because of that, some attitudes violate the very capacities that make moral subjectivity possible. When an attitude is radically incoherent with other commitments, impossible to justify in reasons, unintelligible to other agents, destructive of the shared practices of empathy and cooperation, incompatible with the psychological architecture of moral concern, then the attitude is not merely immoral. It is not the kind of thing that can count as a moral stance at all. This is why we feel we ought not have certain attitudes. Their content undermines the conditions that make moral agency intelligible. How repugnance and entailments matter. Repugnance alone is not enough. People can be repulsed by things they later come to understand. What matters is the entailments of endorsing a preference. If endorsing a preference would collapse your ability to reason coherently, destroy your capacity to justify actions to others, undermine your standing as a participant in moral discourse, make your worldview unintelligible or unadoptable by any other agent, then the preference fails the intelligibility test. This is why liking chocolate cake is fine. It has no destructive entailments. This is why abortion is permissible is discussable. It has coherent reasons and can be articulated. This is why torturing babies for fun is good fails. It destroys the very conditions of intelligibility and agency. The repugnance is a signal, but the entailments are the real defeaters. Why we need a standard for intelligibility. Without a standard, subjectivism collapses into anything goes. But with a standard, we can distinguish mere preferences, cake, moral disagreements, abortion, agency-destroying attitudes, sadistic cruelty. The standard must be factive about human agency, not moral in the realist sense. It must describe what it takes for a preference to be coherent, reason-responsive, communicable, psychologically integrated, shareable in principle. These are not moral facts, they are conditions of being the kind of creature that can have moral attitudes at all. Why unintelligible preferences are rejected. A moral worldview is not just a private set of feelings. It is a collaborative framework that agents use to coordinate, justify, and understand actions. If a preference cannot be explained, justified, or understood by others, then it cannot function as part of a moral worldview. It becomes epistemically defective, like a belief that cannot be defended or even made sense of. This is why we reject certain preferences, even in subjectivism. They fail the conditions of intelligibility, and thus cannot be adopted, shared, or reasoned about. A worldview that others cannot even comprehend is not just unpopular, it is non-functional as a moral worldview. The emerging insight: subjectivism does not mean all attitudes are permissible. It means moral truth depends on the subject, but the subject is constrained by the factive conditions of agency, and only preferences that meet those conditions can count as moral, while preferences that violate them are excluded as unintelligible. This preserves the flexibility of subjectivism, while blocking the catastrophic modal possibilities that make people fear it. A subjective moral framework still needs a way to distinguish between mere preferences and moral judgments, and that distinction depends on the capacities of the agent. Agency in this context is not simply the ability to want things, it is the ability to generate and sustain the epistemic conditions that make moral reasoning possible. A moral agent must be able to form coherent judgments, integrate them with other commitments, articulate reasons, and participate in a shared space of justification. These are factive conditions of human cognition, not objective moral laws. They mark the difference between a creature who can produce intelligible moral claims and a creature who can only behave in ways that have moral significance for others. When a preference or attitude undermines these capacities, by collapsing coherence, destroying empathy, or making the agent's worldview unintelligible, it fails to qualify as a moral stance at all. It becomes the kind of impulse we attribute to beings who lack moral agency, such as a deer or a tiger, whose actions can cause harm but cannot be evaluated as moral or immoral because they do not arise from reason-responsive, world-forming capacities. This framework explains why some attitudes feel like things we ought not have even within subjectivism. The ought here is not an external moral command, but an internal requirement of agency. If an attitude's content or entailments would make your worldview incoherent, unintelligible, or impossible for others to grasp, then holding that attitude undermines your own status as a moral agent. Repugnance signals this breakdown, but the decisive factor is the way endorsing such an attitude would collapse the conditions of intelligibility. Harmless preferences like liking chocolate cake are intelligible because they fit within ordinary human psychology and can be explained. Contentious moral judgments like the permissibility of abortion are intelligible because they can be articulated, justified, and debated within a shared framework of reasons. But attitudes that endorse cruelty for its own sake cannot be integrated into any coherent moral worldview. They destroy the very capacities that make moral subjectivity possible. In this way, subjective morality can still reject certain preferences as inadmissible, not because they violate objective moral facts, but because they violate the factive conditions of agency that make moral reasoning possible in the first place. This can be further demonstrated using explanatory virtues. A subjectivist can reject another subjectivist's preference as failing the best explanation by arguing that, even if the preference is internally coherent, it fails the explanatory virtues that any adequate moral worldview must satisfy. This lets you say, from within subjectivism, that a preference like I prefer to torture babies for fun is not merely odd or distasteful, but fails to be the best explanation of the agent's own moral outlook, and therefore can be rejected without appealing to objective moral facts. The key move is this: a coherent preference is not automatically an explanatorily adequate preference. Moral worldviews must satisfy explanatory virtues such as coherence, depth, scope, non-ad hocness, and integration with human agency. A preference can be coherent yet still fail these virtues so badly that it cannot be part of a robust moral worldview. Why best explanation matters in subjectivism. Subjectivist metaphysics, whether framed as constructivism, ideal observer theory, or reasons internalism, does not treat moral preferences as brute givens. It treats them as outputs of an agent's reasoning, and reasoning is evaluated by explanatory standards. So even if two people share the same metaethical framework, one can still say, your preference is not the best explanation of your own moral outlook, given the standards your worldview itself requires. This is not realism. It is intrasubjectivist critique. How a subjectivist rejects a preference on explanatory grounds. The rejection works by showing that the preference fails one or more explanatory virtues that the worldview itself endorses. 1. Failure of explanatory depth. A preference like I enjoy harming infants for fun is shallow. It gives no deeper account of why this preference fits into the agent's moral psychology, values, or commitments. A subjectivist can say, your explanation is too shallow to count as a moral explanation within your own worldview. 2. Failure of explanatory scope. A moral worldview must explain not just isolated preferences, but the whole network of moral judgments. A preference for cruelty collapses scope because it cannot be integrated with empathy, cooperation, shared agency, communicability of reasons. The critique becomes, your preference cannot explain the rest of your moral commitments without breaking the system. 3. Failure of non-ad hocness. A preference like I just prefer cruelty is ad hoc: it is inserted without grounding, justification, or integration. Subjectivist critique. Your preference is ad hoc and therefore not part of the best explanation of your moral outlook. 4. Failure of fit with the capacities of moral agents. Subjectivist theories assume agents have capacities like empathy, reason giving, and mutual intelligibility. A preference for cruelty contradicts these capacities. The critique. Your preference contradicts the very capacities your worldview presupposes for moral agency. This is not an external moral fact. It is an internal inconsistency with the agent's own assumed psychology. Why this is stronger than mere coherence. Coherence is a minimal condition. Best explanation is a maximal condition. A worldview can be coherent yet explanatorily terrible. A moral preference can be coherent yet explanatorily indefensible. So you can say, even if your preference is coherent, it is not the best explanation of your moral outlook. Any worldview that is both coherent and explanatorily robust would not yield this preference. This gives you a principled way to reject horrific preferences within subjectivism. Why torturing babies for fun fails even under subjectivism. The preference fails every explanatory virtue. It has no depth, no grounding in values or reasons. It has no scope, cannot integrate with any other moral commitments. It is maximally ad hoc, a brute impulse. It contradicts the capacities of moral agents, empathy, communication, shared reasoning. It destroys the intelligibility of the moral worldview itself. So the subjectivist rejection is, your preference is not part of the best explanation of your moral worldview. A coherent and explanatorily robust worldview cannot generate it. This is not realism. It is explanatory eliminativism. The preference is eliminated because it fails the standards of explanation that the worldview itself requires. One who holds the framework of a subjectivist in this way would still have to yield that it is logically possible that a subjectivist could come to the conclusion to torturing babies for fun possible. They could reject any notion of stipulation of a worldview, at which it is said that a coherent explanatory worldview arrives at the conclusion that torturing babies for fun is moral, explaining that one attempted to do it themselves, and have failed to arrive at a coherent conclusion. Further, it is true that one can modify or update a worldview assigning new preferences as they carry on the conversation or debate. This instability, however, is demonstrated as ad hoc take in that it makes for a treadmill conversation as one analysis attitude which repeatedly changes with questioning. How the treadmill problem appears in attitudes toward eggs and chickens. Imagine someone claims, a fertilized chicken egg is not a chicken, but I treat it as morally equivalent to a full chicken, because that's just my preference. At first glance, this is coherent, but when you ask for explanations, the preference begins to wobble. Each attempt to justify it forces the person to revise their stance in an ad hoc way. The treadmill pattern. First explanation, it's because the egg isn't developed enough, but this contradicts treating it as morally equivalent to a chicken. Revised explanation, well, I mean it could become a chicken. Response, but then acorns should be treated as oak trees, and seeds as full plants? Further revision, no, not acorns, just chicken eggs. This is now ad hoc : the rule is being patched to fit the preference. Another revision, okay, it's because chickens are special to me, but then the preference is no longer about eggs or development, it's about sentiment. Final fallback, it's just my preference. This collapses the entire structure into a brute assertion with no explanatory virtues. The conversation goes in circles. Each answer forces a new patch. Nothing stabilizes. Principles at work. A clean, citable set of principles supporting the framework. Established principles. Reflective equilibrium. Reasons responsiveness. Publicity requirement. Constructivist proceduralism. Moral competence. Deliberative validity. Agency conditions. Modal objection. Additional principles. Intelligibility constraint. Agency integrity constraint. Modal safety principle. The intelligibility constraint. Claim. A preference counts as moral only if it is intelligible to other agents. Justification. Supported indirectly by Rawls's publicity requirement. Supported by reasons responsiveness. Supported by constructivist shareability. The agency integrity constraint. Claim. A preference that undermines the capacities that make moral agency possible cannot count as a moral preference. Justification. Supported by moral competence literature. Supported by agency conditions. The modal safety principle. Claim. A moral theory must not allow nearby possible worlds, where atrocities become moral merely due to preference shifts. Justification. Related to modal objections in metaethics. Related to stability requirements in political philosophy. 1. A world without the intelligibility constraint. What the principle normally says. A moral stance must be intelligible, coherent, communicable, and graspable by other agents. Remove it, and the world becomes this. World A. The Babel of moral solitudes. Every agent forms moral preferences that no one else can understand, not because they are controversial, but because they are literally unintelligible. A person might say, my moral truth is glorping the inward spiral of the third feeling of blue. No one knows what this means. No one can ask for reasons. No one can evaluate or challenge it. No one can even tell whether it is a preference, a delusion, or a noise. Yet, because intelligibility is not required, this counts as a moral truth for the agent. What the world becomes. Moral discourse collapses into private monologues. No two agents can coordinate or disagree. Because disagreement presupposes shared meaning, moral truth becomes indistinguishable from hallucination. Agents cannot even know whether they themselves are being coherent. Because self-reflection requires intelligibility. Why the world feels absurd. It is a world where morality exists, but communication does not. A world where moral truth is whatever an agent emits, even if it is semantically void. A world where the very idea of moral reasoning is impossible. This world shows why intelligibility must be a constitutive condition of moral subjectivity. 2. A world without the agency integrity constraint. What the principle normally says. A preference cannot count as moral if it undermines the capacities that make moral agency possible: coherence, empathy, rational integration. Remove it, and the world becomes this. World B. The broken agent's republic. In this world, any preference, no matter how rooted in pathology, delusion, or psychological collapse, counts as a moral stance. A person in a psychotic break who believes, the shadows told me that harming myself is morally required, is treated as having a legitimate moral truth. A person whose empathy system is non-functional and who experiences others only as objects might say, it is morally good to destroy anything that moves, and this is accepted as a valid moral stance. What the world becomes. Moral agency is attributed to beings who lack the capacities that make agency possible. There is no distinction between a moral judgment and a symptom of psychological breakdown. A tiger's predatory impulse counts as a moral stance. A malfunctioning AI's random outputs count as moral truths. A person in a seizure who spasms and shouts yes is treated as making a moral commitment. Why the world feels absurd. It is a world where moral subjectivity is attributed to entities that cannot be subjects. A world where the distinction between agency and malfunction disappears. A world where moral truth is indistinguishable from noise, instinct, or pathology. This world shows why agency integrity must be a grounding condition. 3. A world without the modal safety principle. What the principle normally says. A moral theory must not allow nearby possible worlds where atrocities become moral merely because preferences shift. Remove it, and the world becomes this. World C, the moral weather system. In this world, moral truth is entirely preference-based, and preferences shift like weather. Because there is no modal safety requirement, the following is possible. On Monday, everyone prefers kindness. Kindness is moral. On Tuesday, a charismatic leader convinces people that cruelty is exciting. Cruelty becomes moral. On Wednesday, a viral meme makes indifference fashionable. Apathy becomes moral. On Thursday, a neurochemical contaminant in the water supply alters preferences. Anything could become moral. There is no principle that says some preferences cannot count as moral, even if widely endorsed. What the world becomes. Moral norms swing wildly with mood, fashion, propaganda, or chemical influence. Atrocities become moral whenever enough people temporarily prefer them. No agent can plan long-term moral commitments, because the moral landscape is unstable. A society can drift into horror without violating any principle. Why the world feels absurd. It is a world where morality has the stability of a weather forecast. A world where the difference between good and evil is a matter of what people happen to like this afternoon. A world where the modal space is full of nearby horrors, and nothing blocks them. This world shows why modal safety is necessary to prevent catastrophic drift. Synthesis. Why these worlds demonstrate the need for the principles. Each world is absurd in a different way. World A shows that without intelligibility, morality collapses into noise. World B shows that without agency integrity, morality collapses into pathology. World C shows that without modal safety, morality collapses into volatility and horror. Together, they demonstrate that the novel principles are not arbitrary inventions. They are structural necessities for any subjective moral theory that aims to be stable, communicable, humanly workable, resistant to catastrophic drift.